A tank is built for one purpose, to move forward under fire. But in October 1941, west of Moscow, a panzer column discovers a stranger enemy, one that does not shoot, does not retreat, and does not need to win battles. It only needs to make movement impossible. The column sits nose to tail on what the map calls a road. Engines idle in disciplined intervals, exhaust hanging low in cold, wet air. No shells fall, no aircraft scream overhead, and still the steel does not advance. Tracks are buried to the hubs in mud, brown, heavy adhesive, clinging to armor as if it has intention. Crews stare forward through periscopes and slit visions, waiting for an order that cannot change what lies beneath them. The first revelation arrives without drama, only humiliation. The greatest armored force in Europe is being defeated by something no gun can destroy. Not by enemy tanks, not by a line of anti-tank guns, but by the road itself, by the ground which has decided it will not carry their weight. In the East, terrain is not scenery. It is a participant. It decides what arrives late, and what never arrives at all. Recovery vehicles lurch forward, their own wheels spinning into ruts. Steel cables tighten, sing, then snap with a report too sharp to ignore. Men jump down into the mud with shovels, boots sinking, hands numbed by icy water seeping through gloves. They dig, wedge timbers under tracks, climb back aboard, and try again. Engines roar. Tracks churn. The tanks settle deeper, as if the earth is swallowing them slowly, without haste. A commander unfolds his map on the hood of a staff car. The lines are clean. The arrows are confident. On paper, the advance is geometry, speed turned into certainty. But the earth has rewritten the plan in a language no staff college taught. Ground pressure, axle load, hours lost per kilometer. Radios crackle with reports not of enemy positions, but of vehicles stranded, bridges impassable, fuel delayed behind a traffic jam of immobile machines. Up ahead, Soviet guns reposition with calm patience. They do not need to win today. They only need time. Every stalled hour is another trench deepened, another mine laid, another reserve. In 1939 and 1940, Germany does not simply win battles. It changes the tempo of war. Armored spearheads, motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft move as one system, stitched together by radio. Orders travel faster than messengers. Decisions arrive while the enemy is still interpreting yesterday. What looks like audacity is often coordination, an army learning to make minutes matter. The tanks themselves are not invincible. Panzer II, III, and early the IV models are vulnerable to well-placed fire, thin-skinned compared to the legends they will later become. Their strength is not in any single vehicle, but in concentration. Dozens of machines arriving together, supported by infantry who protect them and guns that silence what threatens them. A lone tank is a target. A massed formation, properly directed, becomes a moving argument that the defender cannot interrupt in time. The Ardennes crossing turns that argument into myth. German armor pushes through forested terrain where planners on the other side have convinced themselves armor cannot go, where roads are narrow, hills steep, and movement feels improbable. The shock is not only physical, it is conceptual. The enemy is forced to defend a front that has already been bypassed. In modern war, being wrong about where the battle will be is often worse than being outgunned. Somewhere along a roadside in France, a tank crew drops into a ditch to eat cold rations. Their faces are smeared with dust and exhaust. Their eyes are ringed with fatigue. Yet the exhaustion carries a kind of intoxication because everything keeps moving. The engine heat never fully leaves their clothes. The column does not pause long enough to feel fear. Momentum itself becomes a shelter. And France, quietly, almost invisibly, cooperates. Its roads carry weight. Its bridges span rivers without collapsing. Fuel can reach the spearhead because the distance is still within the arithmetic of trucks and drums. Infrastructure does what infrastructure is meant to do. It makes speed possible without demanding to be noticed. That success hardens into an assumption more dangerous than any enemy gun, that mobility is a German property, something inherent in doctrine and will rather than a geographic gift temporarily granted by terrain, roads, and season. The early victories teach Germany to trust speed so completely that it begins to forget what speed depends on. And when an army forgets the conditions of its own strength, it walks willingly toward the moment those conditions disappear. Blitzkrieg is remembered as steel and smoke, but its true structure is quieter. Behind every panzer battalion moves an unseen scaffolding. Fuel columns in vulnerable trucks, spare track links stacked like insurance, mechanics with grease-black hands, bridging units carrying pontoons, and staff officers drawing lines across maps that assume the ground will behave. An armored thrust is not only a weapon, it is a chain. And a chain is only as strong as the roads beneath it. German tanks are engineered for a particular kind of Europe. They are built for hard-pack lanes, farm tracks that hold shape in dry weather, and bridges whose load limits can be calculated with confidence. In Poland and France, the infrastructure has a kind of predictability. Even when damaged, it belongs to a world where distances are manageable and repairs can keep pace. This is not a small detail. It is the silent agreement between machine and landscape that makes speed possible. But beneath the romance of horsepower lies a colder measurement: ground pressure. Narrow tracks carrying heavy loads can turn power into waste when soil softens. The same engine that surges across pavement can become a prisoner in clay. The track bites, spins, and polishes mud into a slick paste. The more it fights, the deeper it sinks. In such moments, the earth becomes a break with no drum and no limit. One afternoon, under steady rain, a mechanic kneels beside a tank and replaces a damaged road wheel. The metal is cold. The mud splashes up his sleeves. His tools slip because everything is wet. He works fast, not because he is heroic, but because he understands arithmetic. One immobilized vehicle can halt a column. One halted column can delay fuel. One delayed fuel delivery can stop the tanks ahead, even if those tanks are intact and unchallenged. This is why the doctrine depends on frictionless motion. The faster the advance, the less time the enemy has to form a coherent defense. Speed is not merely convenience. It is the logic of victory. But the system is fragile. When movement slows, supply lines stretch. When supply lines stretch, the spearhead becomes hungry. And a hungry tank, low on fuel, short on spare parts, turns from predator into burden. Germany has built a weapon that wins by flow, and anything that breaks flow, mud, broken bridges, rutted roads, distance itself, becomes a strategic enemy. The question is not whether the Panzer can win a duel. The question is whether it can arrive in time to fight at all.
In June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union begins with a confidence so vast it feels administrative. Operation Barbarossa is not framed as a gamble, but as a timetable, an assumption that the campaign will be decided before winter can arrive with its slow violence. The German army steps east with the certainty of recent victories still warm in its memory, believing that what worked in Poland and France will work again, only larger. On paper, the plan is elegant. Roads will hold, distances will compress under speed. Soviet resistance, once shocked, will fracture into collapse, and collapse will solve the hardest problem of all: logistics. If the enemy breaks quickly enough, fuel shortages do not matter. If the front moves forward fast enough, the map itself becomes an ally. It is a strategy built on the belief that time is something Germany can command. At first, reality seems to cooperate. Encirclements form like clockwork. Columns surge forward in long, dust-choked lines. Prisoners march back in staggering numbers, guarded by men who hardly look at them because the next objective is already calling. Command posts pin new towns onto maps, each name another proof that motion is still possible, that the rhythm of victory can be repeated indefinitely. Somewhere in the rear, officers write letters home. They describe endless skies, wide roads, the strange feeling of a world without boundaries. They speak of easy marches and quick decisions, of an enemy that seems to retreat as if history itself is stepping aside. They mistake the season for permanence. Summer becomes a psychological trap. The sun, the dry ground, the long light of June and July convince them that the landscape will remain cooperative simply because it is cooperative now. But beneath the speed lies a deeper arrogance, treating terrain as background, as if the earth is passive, as if it cannot oppose mechanization. The German advance assumes the land will behave like Western Europe, predictable roads, manageable rivers, short detours. Yet the Soviet Union is not merely a larger battlefield. It is a different kind of battle space, one that can absorb violence without breaking. Soviet space begins to work like a weapon. Armies retreat and survive. Routes are scorched. Bridges are demolished. Villages vanish into smoke. Land is traded for time with a deliberate, brutal patience. The deeper Germany drives, the more the distance itself becomes an enemy, stretching fuel lines, thinning spare parts, and turning speed into something harder to sustain.
Soviet doctrine carries its own kind of brutality, not only toward the enemy but toward its own limitations. If roads fail, movement continues. If trucks cannot pass, trains will. If rails are cut, tracks will churn forward where they can. And when machines cannot go at all, men will walk. It is an attitude formed by geography and history, an acceptance that distance is normal, that infrastructure is fragile, and that war is often fought in conditions where plans dissolve and only endurance remains. That relationship with the land is built into Soviet design. The T-34's wide tracks and sloped armor are not simply technical choices made on a drafting table, they are answers to mud, snow, and the long spaces between supply points. Wide tracks spread weight and bite into soft ground where narrow tracks sink. Sloped armor reduces the weight required for protection and still improves survivability. In the East, engineering is not only about defeating an enemy, it is about surviving the environment long enough to meet the enemy. Even industry is shaped by this logic of depth. Factories move east, beyond the reach of German air power and advancing spearheads, into the Urals and Siberia. It is a relocation of labor, machines, and whole production lines carried out with a harsh efficiency that sacrifices comfort to preserve output. The farther Germany advances, the more Soviet industry seems to grow teeth. Distance which drains German logistics becomes Soviet protection. On a gray morning near a churned-up crossing, a Red Army driver studies the soil before he commits his vehicle. He watches how water pools, how reeds bend, how a cart track disappears into darker mud. He reads the ground like a sailor reads weather, where to cross, where to avoid, where to wait. It is not romance, it is survival. A stuck truck is not merely a delay, it is a target, and in war, targets do not stay alive for long. Villages, forests, and rivers become tools of defense. Choke points are not accidental. They are chosen, prepared, mined, registered for artillery. Bridges are blown not as desperation but as rhythm, forcing German armor into predictable lanes where it can be studied and punished. The landscape becomes a map of intended friction. Slowly, the Germans begin to notice a change in the cost of victory. Each kilometer requires more fuel than the math predicted. Track pins wear faster. Engines run longer at low gear. The calendar begins to matter as much as the enemy. And in that realization lies a deeper truth. In a mechanized war, the side with the better relationship to terrain often inherits the future. Autumn 1941 arrives without ceremony, and then it arrives everywhere. The rains begin, steady and indifferent, turning fields into swamps and roads into something that only resembles a road from a distance. Unpaved routes, so common beyond the old Soviet border, lose their shape, dissolve into ruts, and then into a continuous churn of mud. German columns that once cut across the map like blades become long, immobile sculptures, steel lined up in silence, waiting for the earth to allow them forward. Trucks vanish into the ruts as if lowered by ropes. Drivers gun engines until the wheels spin uselessly. flinging mud in arcs that splatter men's faces and coat windshields in opaque brown. Artillery pieces, meant to roll behind armor with modern efficiency, must be hauled by teams. Horses and men returning to the oldest method of movement because rubber and horsepower have been outvoted by soil. Supply timetables become fiction. A delivery promised for morning arrives at dusk, or not at all. In a mechanized war, logistics is oxygen. Here the air thins. German armor becomes a paradox. The tanks are still lethal. Their guns still penetrate. Their armor still resists. But power that cannot arrive is a kind of irrelevance. A panzer division with empty fuel trucks behind it is not a spear. It is a stranded island, strong in itself, useless to the plan. The battlefield does not reward what you own. It rewards what you can bring to the decisive point on time. A tank commander climbs down and walks ahead, holding a stick like a blind man testing a corridor. He probes the ground in front of his vehicle, measuring depth and firmness by feel, because engines cannot test it safely. A wrong choice here does not mean a minor delay. It means a tank sunk to its belly, a recovery effort that may take hours, and hours that the enemy will spend preparing the next line. Modern warfare, reduced to a man and a stick, is not just inconvenience. It is humiliation with consequences. As German tempo dies, Soviet defense stiffens. The front stops being a sweep and becomes a grind. Kilometers traded for days, days traded for broken machines. The Soviets begin to reposition guns calmly, build fieldworks, and feed reserves into sectors that now hold because the Germans cannot bypass them. The enemy has not become stronger by magic. He has been given time. And commanders face a new kind of fear. Not encirclement, the nightmare they trained for, but stagnation. Being fixed in place while enemy strength accumulates around them. It is here the revelation settles in with cold clarity. When the temperature plunges, war does not pause. It changes its physics. Lubricants thicken until engines turn reluctantly, as if waking from sleep. Batteries lose strength and fail without warning. Rubber stiffens. Steel, so reliable in summer, becomes brittle under sudden stress. A vehicle designed to endure enemy fire can be undone by a morning that is simply too cold to start. For a brief moment, the frozen ground seems like mercy. What mud stole, ice returns, hard surfaces, traction, the possibility of movement again. Tanks that had been prisoners in autumn ruts can finally roll. Columns creep forward, hopeful that winter might be the strange ally that restores German tempo. But winter does not give without taking. Snow arrives, deep and uneven, concealing ditches and soft patches beneath a clean white surface. Ice coats roadways and tracks, turning control into gamble. Mechanical failure becomes as common as combat. German crews improvise because there is no other choice. They light fires beneath engines to warm oil pans, risking smoke that can be seen for kilometers. They wrap equipment in scavenged blankets, line boots with newspaper, and steal insulation from abandoned buildings. Maintenance becomes a desperate ritual performed in open air, hands shaking, tools freezing to skin. In these conditions, every task takes longer, and every delay invites death. Not from drama, but from exposure and artillery. Inside a tank, a loader grips cold metal shells and feels his hands split and bleed. The pain is immediate, but he keeps working because stopping is not an option. A crew that cannot reload cannot fight. A crew that cannot fight cannot hold the position. And a crew that abandons the vehicle may not survive the walk back. In mechanized war, men and machines share one fate. Weakness in either spreads quickly to both. Soviet forces, better adapted in clothing and doctrine, use winter not as punishment but as opportunity. White camouflage breaks silhouettes in snow. Ski troops move where wheeled vehicles cannot. Counterattacks strike at flanks and supply lines, harassing stalled formations with a patience learned from living in the same climate. They maneuver in the cold because they have prepared for it, and because for them, winter is not an interruption. It is a season of war. A technological truth emerges in the frost. Vehicles are ecosystems. Fuel, Oil, rubber, steel, and human endurance held in one fragile balance. When one component fails, the whole, as the front hardens and movement becomes uncertain, mobility turns into an engineering contest. Battles are no longer decided only by who has the better gun, but by who can build a crossing before dawn, who can repair a culvert under fire, who can keep a road usable one more day. Pontoon bridges appear like temporary miracles across icy rivers. Corduroy roads, logs laid side by side over mud, try to turn swamp into surface. Every kilometer forward begins to depend on men whose weapons are saws, shovels, explosives, and time. German pioneers perform feats that seem impossible in the moment. They throw bridges across gaps that should stop an army. They rebuild approaches with whatever material exists, timber, rubble, scrap metal, while artillery searches for them. But miracles do not scale. A single successful crossing can feel like a victory, yet each crossing costs hours, then days, and the doctrine cannot afford that kind of payment. Blitzkrieg depends on tempo. Engineering depends on patience. When the war becomes an engineer's problem, speed stops being a principle and becomes a request. Recovery becomes its own battlefield. A bogged tank is not simply a stranded vehicle. It is a magnet for attention. Towing it demands tractors, cables, winches, and exposed men working in the open. Every attempt to save a machine creates a stationary target, and stationary targets invite artillery, mortar fire, and, when skies clear, air attack. The front line is no longer only where bullets fly. It is wherever a disabled vehicle forces men to stand still. In one churned clearing, a recovery team hooks cables while shells fall nearby, their impacts throwing dirt and fragments into the air. They crouch, rise, tighten, signal, and tighten again, risking lives to save a machine that may still be lost tomorrow. The logic is ruthless. Tanks are scarce. Crews are trained, and a single vehicle can be the difference between holding a road junction or losing it. Yet the act of recovery exposes the cold truth of mechanized war. Men bleeding for steel because steel has become more replaceable than time. The Soviets increasingly weaponized terrain with a deliberate design. Dams are blown to flood approaches. Roads are mined to funnel armor into predictable lanes. Crossings are registered for artillery. The land is shaped not merely to slow, but to script where German armor must go, so it can be met, measured, and destroyed. German adaptations arrive, Germany answers the growing threats on the battlefield with a familiar instinct. Build something better. As Soviet armor improves and Allied firepower increases, the response is heavier tanks, Panthers and Tigers, machines designed to dominate through armor thickness, long-range guns, and the promise that in a head-to-head duel, the German crew will prevail. On the proving grounds and in carefully chosen engagements, the theory looks convincing. The new tanks do not merely fight, they intimidate. But weight is not only protection. It is a bargain with the ground, and the ground always collects its payment. Bridges that carried earlier panzers can fail under the new loads, forcing detours that cost hours and fuel. Soft fields swallow heavy vehicles to their bellies. A tank that cannot be recovered is not merely lost, it becomes a landmark, a steel monument to overconfidence. And recovery with these giants is often harder than combat. Winches strain, tow cables snap. Two vehicles are needed to pull one. The very excellence of the machine creates a new kind of fragility. Mechanical reliability strains under complexity. Panthers arrive with power and promise, but also with teething troubles, maintenance demands, and parts that cannot always reach the front in time. A Tiger can be dominant in battle and still absent from the decisive moment because it is broken down in a ditch, or waiting for a final drive, or stranded for lack of fuel that never caught up. In modern war, presence matters as much as capability. A weapon that exists only in theory is not a weapon, it is a hope. A Tiger crew receives an order to advance. Hatches slam, the engine rumbles, the column begins to move, and then the lead vehicle stops. The crew watches, helpless, as mechanics swarm around it. No enemy has fired, no mine has detonated. Yet the offensive pauses because the heaviest tank on the road has turned into an immovable object. The moment is not dramatic. It is worse. It is ordinary. Meanwhile, Soviet defenses deepen. Anti-tank ditches cut across likely avenues. Mine belts thicken. Artillery concentrations wait behind registered zones. These obstacles do not merely threaten to destroy German armor. They force it to move slowly, to bunch up, to approach along predictable lines, exactly where weight and congestion hurt most, exactly where the terrain's power to delay becomes lethal. The truth becomes cruel in its simplicity. As German tanks become more formidable, they also become more dependent on perfect terrain, perfect recovery, perfect fuel flow, perfect timing. Summer 1943. Germany stakes its remaining offensive confidence on Kursk, an armored gamble meant to restore initiative and prove that the Panzer Arm still owns the decisive moment. The intent is familiar. Break through, exploit, encircle, and force the enemy to collapse under speed. It is the old faith, called back like a prayer. But the Red Army has spent months preparing an answer that does not rely on matching German armor tank for tank. Around Kursk, the Soviets turn earth into architecture. Defensive belts stack behind one another like layers of stone, trenches, wire, anti-tank ditches cut deep enough to halt a hull, minefields laid in densities that do not merely threaten, they dictate. The ground is mapped, measured, and rehearsed. Artillery batteries are registered on likely approaches. This is not terrain. It is terrain arranged with intent, shaped to make motion slow and predictable. German armor advances into that design 1 meter at a time. Every movement becomes a negotiation with obstacles half seen and explosives fully hidden. A breakthrough is no longer a surge, it is a procedure. The battlefield does not offer open space to exploit, it offers lanes to be punished. A Panther platoon creeps forward behind mine-clearing teams, the storm reduced to a careful crawl. Men with probes and charges work the soil while engines idle, exposed. The new tanks, built for dominance, wait like athletes forced to walk through a narrow corridor, their speed meaningless until the corridor is cleared. Each delay is not merely lost time. It is time granted to every Soviet gun already sighted on the route. When vehicles stall, on mines, in ditches, in congestion, artillery and anti-tank guns turn immobility into a sentence. A stop tank is easier to range. A clustered column is easier to saturate. In such conditions, even a superior machine becomes fragile because the enemy is not asking it to duel. The enemy is asking it to sit still. And when the offensive loses momentum, the losses become unrecoverable. Machines and trained crews are consumed faster than replacements can arrive, faster than Germany's strained industry can breathe life back into the order of battle. The revelation at Kursk is brutal in its clarity. The ground is not merely difficult, it has been intentionally structured to break the very philosophy of armored breakthrough. And after Kursk, the question is no longer whether the panzers can attack, but where in the modern war they can still move without the earth itself becoming a trap. In 1944, German armor meets a different kind of betrayal, far from the Russian mud and snow. Normandy is green, close, and deceptively familiar. Fields, lanes, small villages. But the land here has its own defenses, grown over centuries rather than engineered in months. The bocage, thick hedgerows sitting on earthen embankments, fractures vision and momentum, turning open farmland into a maze of rooms with walls no tank can see through. In this terrain, movement itself becomes exposure. A tank approaching a hedgerow cannot simply drive through it. It must climb. And when a tank crests that embankment, its nose lifts, its belly armor rises into view, and for a brief, fatal moment, the vehicle presents its weakest underside to whatever is waiting beyond. The machine designed to dominate ground combat is forced to reveal its vulnerability as the price of crossing a boundary made of roots and soil. The fields become compartments. Every lane becomes an ambush corridor. A battle that in open country might be decided by range and maneuver is here reduced to seconds and angles. Speed dies in 1,000 short engagements, brief flashes of violence, then silence, then another hedge, another turn, another blind corner. Even sound becomes unreliable, muffled by earth and foliage. Crews learn that survival is not about seeing farther, but about seeing first. In one field, an American crew sits motionless, listening. Not watching, listening. Behind a hedge, engines can be heard before tanks can be seen, a low vibration that travels through soil and leaves. The men wait for that sound to grow closer, knowing the first sign of the enemy may not be a silhouette, but a sudden impact. Metal punched, fuel ignited, the instant transformation from armored protection to burning confinement. Here, warning often arrives at the same time as disaster. Engineers and improvisers begin to fight the landscape as much as the enemy. Hedgerow cutters are welded onto tank noses to bite through the embankments without climbing them. Bulldozers shove paths where roads cannot be trusted. Explosives are used not just against fortifications, but against the terrain itself, forcing mobility back into a place designed by nature and agriculture to deny it. Each solution is practical, local, and hard-earned. German defensive skill. Winter 1944. Germany launches its last great offensive in the West by reaching back to an old habit. Surprise, speed, and the belief that bold movement can change strategic reality. The Ardennes, thick forests, narrow valleys, quiet roads, seems to offer what Normandy denied, a place where an armored thrust might slip through, fracture the front, and buy time through shock. It is an offensive built on urgency, because time has stopped being Germany's ally. But armor cannot escape the tyranny of roads. In the Ardennes, movement is not freedom across open ground. It is a forced march along constricted routes. Columns funnel into narrow lanes, and narrow lanes create traffic jams. A single breakdown becomes a dam. Vehicles bunch up nose to tail, engines idling, exhaust clouding the cold air. Fuel consumption rises not from fighting, but from waiting. Timing, the fragile heart of the plan, becomes vulnerable to the smallest mechanical failure. Snow and ice return, rewriting the landscape again. Tires lose grip. Tracks slide on frozen slopes. Recovery vehicles struggle to reach stranded machines because there is no room to pass. Congestion turns momentum into delay. Delay turns into exposure. The offensive that must move quickly begins instead to announce itself through immobility. Long lines of vehicles visible from above whenever the weather lifts. In one column, a German tanker watches his fuel gauge fall while the engine idles. He cannot switch it off for long. The cold makes restarting uncertain, and orders demand readiness. So the tank burns gasoline in place, hour after hour, turning a strategic resource into exhaust. He can see the road ahead, and he can see it is blocked. He can hear the distant guns, and he knows that by the time he reaches them, the moment the plan was built for may already have passed. Then the skies clear. Allied air power, once freed from cloud and fog, punishes what is predictable. Stalled vehicles become targets. Fuel trucks become flames. Supply lines, stretched along narrow roads, are cut like arteries. Mobility becomes a liability when it is constrained to corridors the enemy can map and strike. The offensive begins to consume itself, not only on resistance at the front but on the mathematics behind it. Distance, fuel, and road capacity. These quiet numbers grind the attack down. The Ardennes offensive exhausts itself, and with it drains the last reserves of initiative Germany can still spend. The revelation is colder than any. By 1945, Germany fights inside a continent it has helped shatter. The infrastructure that once made modern war possible is broken almost everywhere. Bridges down, rail lines cut, and roads cratered by constant air attack. What remains is a landscape of interruptions. Detours around collapsed spans, convoys forced onto secondary routes, fuel deliveries delayed not by enemy armor, but by the absence of pavement. The map still shows connections. The ground offers only gaps. Rivers become strategic walls, not because they are wider than before, but because crossing them has become predictable. A destroyed bridge narrows choice to a few fords and a few rebuilt spans, and those spans draw fire as surely as a lighthouse draws ships. Engineers become as vital as tank aces, because without a crossing, the tanks are reduced to spectators on the wrong bank. In late war Europe, a pontoon bridge is often more decisive than a new gun. Cities, meanwhile, turn into rubble mazes. Armor loses its long sight lines. Streets are choked with debris, tram lines twisted, buildings collapsed into angled heaps that block turrets and tracks. Infantry threats multiply in the vertical space. Windows, cellars, stairwells, where a tank's armor is thickest in the wrong direction. Maneuver shrinks from sweeping arcs to street-by-street coercion, where every corner is a question and every answer risks a hit at point-blank range. A crew reverses through broken masonry, their driver sweating despite the cold. They are not hunting enemy tanks. They are afraid of a hidden anti-tank team in a cellar. Men with a Panzerfaust or a captured weapon, waiting for the moment the tank's side presents itself in a narrow street. The greatest danger is not a duel, but a sudden, unseen shot from 10 meters away. In ruins, the battlefield becomes intimate, and intimacy is lethal. Heavy tanks, once symbols of dominance, become increasingly difficult to fuel, repair, and recover. Their appetite for gasoline is now a strategic liability. Their breakdowns are often final because recovery vehicles cannot reach them, or bridges cannot carry them, or time cannot be spared. Many are abandoned intact, not defeated by enemy fire, but by the impossibility of keeping them alive as systems. The Allies and Soviets exploit terrain with doctrine. Coordinated artillery breaks concentrations. Air interdiction destroys roads and bridges faster than engineers can replace them. Systematic bridge building and river crossings are conducted with an industrial rhythm that denies Germany operational breath. The revelation settles over the last months like dust over shattered streets. When maneuver disappears, German armor culture elevates the duel. It imagines war in clean terms. Gun versus gun, armor versus armor, crew skill deciding outcomes in moments of clarity. In memoirs and after-action reports, the tank fight becomes a kind of craft, a test of nerve and gunnery where superiority can be measured in range and penetration. But war rarely offers fair duels, and it almost never offers them on ground that cooperates. The deeper contest is systemic. It is fought in fuel consumption rates, in the depth of maintenance units, in the availability of spare parts and tow cables, in the quiet question of whether a damaged vehicle can be recovered before it becomes enemy salvage. A tank is not a knight. It is an ecosystem that must be fed and repaired. If the supply chain falters, the most powerful machine becomes a stationary object, and stationary objects do not shape campaigns. Terrain exposes the ethical coldness of mechanization. Men become custodians of steel, risking their lives not only to fight but to preserve equipment because equipment is scarce. In this logic, human life and mechanical value begin to trade places. A recovery crew works under shell fire to save a tank. A mechanic freezes in the open to keep an engine alive. The machine demands labor, and the labor is paid in risk. A crew stands beside its disabled tank at dusk, listening to the distant approach of enemy units. The vehicle cannot be towed. The ground is wrong, the recovery assets absent, the time gone. They set charges or pour fuel, and then they burn it. Flames climb over armor plate that once promised protection. The men watch without ceremony because there is no ceremony left. They are destroying what once symbolized advantage to prevent it becoming the enemy's advantage. In mechanized war, loss is sometimes chosen rather than suffered. Innovation continues because Germany cannot stop innovating. Improved guns, thicker armor, better optics, each refinement attempts to restore dominance through engineering. Yet each improvement increases weight, complexity, and dependence on stable ground. The machine becomes more formidable in theory and more demanding in practice. A weapon designed to impose begins to require perfect conditions to function. It needs bridges that hold, roads that bear weight, supply lines that arrive on schedule. It needs the Earth's permission. Meanwhile, the enemy's advantage becomes not mystical courage, but practical adaptation. Wide tracks that float over mud, massed mines that dictate routes, engineered obstacles that slow breakthroughs into procedures, and patient defense that turns time into a weapon. The landscape is no longer something to be endured. It is something to be used. And here is, in the beginning, German armor feels like destiny. It arrives with speed, coordination, and modern confidence, as if the future has chosen a side. Columns move with radio-linked precision, air and ground striking in sequence, maps filling with arrows that seem to turn geography into a simple problem of direction. For a time, it looks inevitable, steel imposing its will on anything in front of it. But the war teaches a harsher law, one that is older than engines and deeper than doctrine. Machines do not conquer landscapes, they negotiate with them. Every vehicle is a request made to the earth. Carry this weight, accept this pressure, allow this motion. When the ground refuses, there is no appeal. Firepower cannot argue with mud. Courage cannot persuade a river. A brilliant plan cannot compress distance. Mud steals time. Snow steals reliability. Hedgerows steal visibility. Rivers steal momentum. Ruins steal maneuver. Each terrain does not merely inconvenience, it changes the very grammar of combat. What was once an offensive built on flow becomes a series of stoppages. Bridges to rebuild, roads to repair, lanes to clear, engines to warm, fuel to find. The battlefield becomes less a place to be mastered than a force to be endured. Years later, a veteran remembers less the victories than the waiting. The long hours listening to engines idle in cold air. The way men watched the sky not for enemy aircraft alone, but for weather. Clouds that grounded air support, frost that might harden roads, rain that would turn movement into futility. He remembers staring at ground that would not carry them, as if the soil itself had an opinion and had chosen to speak in silence. And in that memory, the moral reversal settles in. The weapon designed to impose will become hostage to conditions it cannot intimidate. A tank can frighten infantry. It cannot frighten a season. It can destroy an enemy position. It cannot destroy the fact of a flooded valley or a collapsed bridge. The environment does not need to defeat you in battle. It only needs to deny you the ability to fight on your own terms. The ground does not hate, and it does not fear. It simply exists, indifferent, unmoved by ambition. In the end, that indifference proves decisive because it outlasts slogans, outlasts plans, outlasts even the strongest armor plate. They built armor to dominate the battlefield until the battle